Okay, today we're going to take a look at the How Many Cakes challenge on Topcoder. So first let me clear my screen and make sure I have up all the files that I need for this challenge. Okay, now the basis of this challenge was to create the beginnings of, I'm guessing, a user interface that will start an app that will show someone how many cakes they can make by means of a recipe and the number of ingredients that they have in their pantry. So the first thing I did is I created a pantry class. The pantry class holds basically is constructed using an inventory. Now this inventory is a hash, and again the hash is one of the best data structures for this because it can hold not only the item itself but the number of items that I have in something. I've built a couple of classes into this. This is the include class, the include question mark, and this just checks to see if the inventory of the pantry contains that key item. Then I've built in a use, so when the item is used from the pantry, it subtracts the amount of that item from the pantry itself. Okay, and then the add item, it basically just adds a new item into the pantry, say if an item is purchased. So that is the pantry class. The next class is the recipe class. Now this recipe class is just a container for holding the recipe itself. Again, a hash is passed in called ingredients, and this is just a comparative object that allows me to modify a recipe should I need to, or to simply use the recipe to compare against what I have in the pantry. And then finally I have the cakes method. Now this cakes method is going to compare those items that I have in the recipe versus the items I have in the pantry, and then it's going to see if baking cakes is possible. If it is, it will bake the cakes and show me the number of cakes that I can bake using the number of ingredients I have in the pantry. Or it will tell me I'm either missing an ingredient from the pantry or I don't have the correct amount of an ingredient in the pantry. So the main class is called cakes. It takes in a recipe and a pantry. And what this does first is it checks to see if I have the proper ingredients to bake the cake. So it creates two variables called missing and low, and it's going to run the check inventory method that is right below it to see if I am missing any ingredients or if I have a low number of ingredients. Alright, so what this does, the check inventory, is it compares the recipe to the pantry. It creates two empty arrays, and then it iterates through the recipe, the ingredients of the recipe, and checks them against the pantry. So if the pantry includes the ingredient, the key that's being passed in, and if it doesn't have enough of the ingredient, so basically I'm checking to see if the inventory of the pantry minus the number of items needed from the recipe is less than 0, then I'm going to pass that ingredient into the low array, and that will again be passed out later. However, if that ingredient is not in the pantry, then that ingredient is passed into the missing array, and again we will return the missing and low ingredients after the recipe is done iterating. Then I've set up a baked variable, and this is going to return the number of cakes that can be baked if I'm not missing an ingredient or if I'm not low on an ingredient. Then I return the results of baked, missing, and low, and we'll talk about that method momentarily. Now the baked method takes in a recipe and a pantry. Now remember, the baked method will only populate baked if I'm not missing an ingredient or low on an ingredient. So basically what happens here is it compares the recipe again, or it iterates over the recipe, and for each item in the recipe it checks the inventory versus the number of items needed for that recipe, and then passes it into the array called baked. Now, once that is done, we return the array of baked. And then we checked the results baked against the parameters baked, missing, and low. And what this does is it checks our baked, if we're not missing an ingredient or low on an ingredient, it checks that baked array that's passed in, and it returns the minimum value of that array. Now the reason it does this is because if we go through our ingredients for a recipe and we go through the pantry and we bake each cake, if one of those ingredients will only allow us to bake one cake, but all the other ingredients allow us to bake 2 cakes, we can only bake 1 cake. The other cake will be missing or low on an ingredient later. So it will turn that minimum value of 1 if we can only bake 1 depending upon the ingredients. And of course, if we can't bake any because we're missing an ingredient or low on an ingredient, it will return 0. Now if we take a step back to the baked method momentarily, what I've done is I've commented out the use method from the pantry. Now when we are going through and baking cakes, if we only have one pantry for several different recipes, what I would want to do then is uncomment this use method, because then that will start removing items from the pantry as we finish baking cakes. And if I'm moving on to subsequent recipes in the future that require those same ingredients, then that recipe will return missing or low if those ingredients have been used for a previous recipe. And I'll show you how that works in a minute. Now, we were asked to keep track of the missing and low options, but not to implement them until later. So I'm not going to actually implement that in this pass. But I could show you how that works when that happens. But for now, let's go ahead and first we'll test my my spec. So let me go ahead and open that spec file real fast. Now the spec file tests each of these items. One, that should a cake be baked, right, it will return the number of cakes that are able to be baked. So if I take a look at the expectation, I'm passing in recipe 1 and pantry 1 to the cakes method. Now pantry 1 contains it is basically a new pantry item, new pantry object that contains 1,200 units of flour, 1,200 units of sugar, 5 eggs, and 200 units of milk. Now the recipe 1 requires 500 units of flour, 200 units of sugar, and 1 egg unit. Now once that runs through, it should return 2 cakes that have been baked. So when that test happens, 2 cakes have been baked, and we'll actually run through that real fast to show you what happens over here. The next method, or the next test how the method handles missing items in the cake. Now what I intend to do is to create an alert once those methods are tested for the future iterations of this exercise. But for now, what I'm returning is that if a cake is missing items, it will be unable to bake any, and so you will have the return item of 0. And then finally, I'm testing what will happen if there are not enough items in the pantry. So this is that low parameter that I have that we've seen earlier. And so again, if I have an insufficient number of items in the pantry, I will be unable to bake the cake, and it should return 0. All right, so let's go ahead and run that RSpec real fast. And as you can see, it passes. It returns the maximum number of cakes using the items in the pantry, so 2 cakes were baked. If it handles missing items correctly, so 0 cakes were baked, and it handles insufficient items in the pantry, again, so 0 cakes were baked. Now, if we want to actually see that in action, what we're going to do is we're going to go up here and comment that out right now. That's actually for a later build. And what we're going to see is I'm basically created 3 pantry objects and 3 recipe objects, just like I did in the test, and we're actually going to see those return values as they play out. Alright, so I'm going to run the file. And as you can see, with the first recipe and pantry, it returned 2 cake items. With the second recipe and pantry, and this was the recipe and pantry that was missing an item, so recipe 2 required apples and oil, which weren't in the pantry. We only have sugar, flour, and milk in the pantry, but I needed 3 apples and 100 units of oil, and so those items were missing. And so 0 cakes were able to be baked. And finally, recipe 3, I didn't have enough items, so in the pantry I have 300 units of sugar, 2,500 units of flour, 300 units of chocolate, 7 eggs, and 100 units of milk. And what's going to happen then is, if I take a look at my recipe, I need 200 units of chocolate, which should be good, 100 units of milk, also good, 2 eggs, also good, 300 units of flour, definitely good, but I need 400 units of sugar, and I only have 300 units in the pantry. And again, so because I'm low on that unit, I will be unable to bake any cakes, and so it will return 0. Now my intent for later is to actually make this an alert, and so eventually, depending on what's missing, I can actually alert the user via the console that we are either missing or low. So if I actually do that now, run that same file, notice I have alerts down here, and if I actually separate this return to alert missing item if missing is not empty, or and then put the low on a different line. So let me actually do that real fast to show you what I intend to happen later. And of course I can go through the array and actually print to console each missing item later. But for now, let's just show the alert if I'm just missing an item. Let's comment this out temporarily. Okay, and same thing for the low item. Okay, so basically what's going to happen here is, should the item be missing, it should alert missing item, and if the item is low, it should alert low item. So let's go ahead and run that one more time. And again, this is for a future date and for a future spec and a future iteration of this exercise, but just to see the possibilities, notice I was missing an item, so it returned missing item, insufficient item returned insufficient item. And so we can go through and create various iterations of this, but for this particular challenge, we just needed to make sure that it returned 0. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do here. Run the test one more time, and as you can see, it works exactly as it should. Again, if there are any questions, please feel free to send them in the forum, and I will answer them as soon as possible. Have a good day.